All these things solidified the military conquest. Indeed, military successes of the 16th century went beyond the imagination of the Manchu founders. Conquest was extended by the great Kangxi Emperor, whose reign began in 1662 when he was still a boy and lasted until his death 60 years later. Kangxi personally led campaigns against the Mongols in 1696 and conquered Tibet, bringing Tibet into the realm in 1720. Thus, the Qing had not only conquered the Ming realm, it had built a much larger and different empire. It had expanded the empire dramatically into Central Asia on a scale only matched by the Tang. But if the Manchus gained and early on maintained control by force, ultimately their security came in ruling well, in peace and in prosperity. You may remember what a counselor is said to have told Liu Bang, the founder of the Han Dynasty. It's one thing to conquer, it's quite another to rule. The empire can be conquered from horseback, but it must be ruled from the palace. Military success, in other words, would be temporary without a durable political settlement and the institutionalization of rule. Li Zicheng, the bandit in Beijing whom the Manchus threw out, one of his supporters was supposed to have said of him, Li Zicheng was only a horseback king. And this is where the Manchus, particularly the great Kangxi Emperor and the great Qianlong Emperor, distinguished themselves. An enduring question of modern Chinese history is how this large and populous and differentiated country can be governed by such a thin ruling elite over time. And this was even more a question for the Manchus, who constituted an even thinner than normal ruling stratum. And from the outset they ruled, in some sense, as a Sino-foreign enterprise, a two-tiered or parallel ruling system of Manchus and Chinese, with the Manchus as governors general, supervising Chinese governors of provinces. Their central institutions were staffed, too, not only primarily by Manchus, but what John Fairbank called a diarchy of Manchus and Chinese. They appealed to Chinese elites not just by offering, as it were, governance sharing. What they did essentially was to seek also legitimacy by placing themselves in the mantle of Chinese tradition. They imposed themselves on Ming institutions, and early on gave the last Ming emperor a proper burial, even as they were butchering his heirs. They maintained not only the examination system, but the Ming curriculum for the exams. And in time, Manchu emperors, Kangxi, Yongzheng, Qianlong, would be at the center of high Chinese culture as chief patrons of painting and poetry and literature. They would portray themselves as sage rulers, and indeed came to be competent calligraphers and connoisseurs of calligraphy and painting. For all their personal differences, they would be portrayed essentially the same in official portraiture. And indeed, perhaps with the zeal of converts, it may be said, and indeed has been said by historians, that the early Qing rulers were among the greatest promoters of Chinese culture, Chinese literature, the arts, and even science, of any dynasty. Perhaps equally important, they gradually gained the allegiance of Chinese elites by maintaining the inherited social order, and indeed improving it by bringing peace after their conquest, in a kind of a social compact, especially with the elite landholders of the lower Yangtze region, who were given a large degree of local economic autonomy. The Kangxi Emperor believed that a large population meant greater prosperity. And to help encourage it, and as a kind of a political understanding with the landholding elites, he froze the land tax in 1712. That is to say, he froze assessments of able-bodied men registered as working a given area of land, and said that if the population increased in a particular area, that statistic would not therefore raise that area's taxes. He could do this in part because the dynasty was financially autonomous from the state, revenues from imperial lands and monopolies coming to the throne outside of formal bureaucratic controls. The imperial household also received custom duties, controlled the imperial kiln at Jingdezhen, and so on. But it was the Qing equivalent of what you might call a no new taxes pledge, although he was never known to have said, as the former President Bush once did, "read my lips." He did make people read his edict. The Yongzheng emperor would try to rationalize the empire's tax system, which was based on late Ming land registrations that were notoriously incorrect and corrupt. But he would be limited in part by filial piety for his father, the Kangxi emperor, and he would maintain this land tax freeze, as would his successors.